All right, let's jump right into today's deep dive. We're dissecting this research paper, Responsible Design Patterns for Machine Learning Pipelines. And I know you're all deep into mathematics, machine learning, all that data science, so we're going to cut right to those core insights.
Absolutely. The authors are tackling, a pretty crucial challenge, how to build responsible AI systems. And so they propose this framework. It's responsible AI design patterns, or they shorten it to RAIDPs to integrate through the whole machine learning pipeline.
REI, DPs.
Okay.
I like it. What makes these patterns so special?
Well, they give us like a systematic way to address ethical considerations at each stage.
Yeah.
So from data collection all the way to deployment and monitoring. And the nice thing is they're not just like theoretical ideas, they're actually offering, practical guidance for building AI systems responsibly.
So it's like a blueprint for ethical AI development.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
where do they start? Where's
Yeah.
the beginning?
Well, right at the very beginning with data collection, they introduced this concept of a bill of materials, but not just for like, the technical specs of the data, but also like it's ethical provenance. So it's all about making sure there's transparency and accountability right from the get-go, from the source.
Bill of materials for data.
Right.
That's a new one. I'm used to thinking of that for, physical products, not data sets.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so innovative. I mean, it's applying a concept from, like the real physical world to the digital one,
Mhm.
really emphasizing the importance of ethical sourcing and how we document our data.
That makes a lot of sense. So what's next after we've, ethically sourced our data?
Pre-processing. So that's the next step.
Sure.
And the paper highlights the need for vulnerability analysis, but not just in the, the typical sense. They're arguing for considering like ethical vulnerabilities too that might be embedded in our data.
Interesting. It's like we're not just cleaning the data, but sanitizing it for ethical issues.
Exactly. It's like recognizing that data, it can carry inherent biases or privacy risks, even if it's like technically sound.
Okay, so we've got our ethically sourced and pre-processed data. What's the next step in this pipeline?
Training. That's where we are now. And
Yeah.
and this is where it gets pretty interesting, I think. They propose this idea of an ethical sandbox. So it's kind of like a simulated environment where developers can test their AI models for ethical behavior before they ever deploy them in the real world.
I like that, ethical sandbox. It sounds like a safe space to let our AI models run wild, see how they behave.
Yeah,
Ah,
exactly. It's about creating a controlled environment where we can, rigorously test for potential ethical issues like bias or, unintended consequences, things like that.
so instead of waiting for those problems to pop up in the real world, we're trying to catch them early on.
Exactly. Right. And the ethical sandbox allows for experimenting with different mitigation strategies and seeing what really works best, but without any of the real world risks. And they also talk about global view auditing and AI ethics auto testing and AI ethics patching, emphasizing how important it is to have these layered checks and balances.
Yeah, it makes sense. So after we've trained our model in the ethical sandbox, how do we make sure that it keeps behaving ethically, once it's out in the real world?
Yeah, that's where the patterns for the inference stage come in. So the paper talks about, a bunch of different options, including MDM, homogeneous redundancy, incentive registry, continuous ethical validator, ethical knowledge base, federated learner, and co-versioning registry.
Okay, that's a lot of options. Are there any that stand out as particularly innovative?
Yeah, one that I thought was really interesting is the AI mode switcher.
Hmm.
It kind of recognizes that there are going to be situations where we need to prioritize ethical behavior over like, pure performance. So this pattern, it lets users actually adjust the AI's decision-making process to favor those ethical considerations, even if it means, sacrificing a little bit of efficiency.
So it's like a trade-off switch. If speed and accuracy are, the most important thing, we can prioritize that. But if the ethics are more important, we can flip the switch and prioritize those instead.
Yeah, exactly. It gives us that flexibility and control over how the AI system is operating, depending on the context.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these patterns, they work together to create this more robust and ethical development
Yeah.
process. So what happens next? After we've deployed our model, what's the next stage?
Deployment, that's where we are. They really stress the importance of breaking down deployment into, these three key steps: the request, the decision making, and the execution. And the idea is to integrate those ethical considerations into every single one of those steps, making sure that the AI system is operating responsibly, right from the moment it's released.
So it's not just about deploying the model and hoping for the best. We need to think about the ethical implications, every step of the way.
Yeah. Exactly. It's about being proactive about those ethical risks.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about monitoring? How do we make sure that our AI keeps behaving ethically over time, especially as the world around it changes?
Yeah, that's a great point. They recommend a concept called zero trust AI. It's kind of an adaptation of the zero trust security model, but instead of focusing on security threats, it focuses on ethical ones.
Zero trust AI. That's interesting. Sounds like we're not taking any chances. So how does it work?
So basically, it's about assuming that ethical drift can happen, right? And so we need to implement this continuous monitoring to detect it and then address it. They propose using techniques like ethical drift detection to try to identify those maybe subtle changes in the AI system's behavior that might mean it's deviating from those ethical standards.
So it's like we've got this ethical watchdog constantly monitoring our AI, making sure there are no signs of trouble.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that, AI systems, they're dynamic. They're learning and evolving over time. And as they evolve, their ethical behavior, it can drift, even if we've taken all the right steps during development.
So it's not a set it and forget it thing. We need to always be watching and ready to adjust course if we see those ethical issues cropping up. What specific methods are they suggesting for that ethical drift detection?
Well, they suggest using a bunch of different techniques, including like monitoring the AI's decision-making process, analyzing all that data it's being fed, and doing regular audits to make sure it's still operating within those ethical boundaries. Oh, and they also suggest using a co-versioning registry to keep track of all those changes and try to identify, potential points where that ethical drift might happen.
So a pretty comprehensive approach using all different kinds of tools. It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground here, from data collection to pre-processing, training, inference, deployment, and monitoring.
Yeah.
So these RAIDPs, they really cover the entire AI lifecycle.
Yeah, they do. They're a holistic framework for building those responsible AI systems. And to show how these patterns work in practice, they give a specific example, the bias mitigation design pattern.
Okay, let's dig into that a bit. I'm curious to see how they're tackling, one of the biggest challenges in AI.
All right. So this bias mitigation design pattern, it's all about tackling that bias issue head on. And they've got three core solutions for this. First, you got to use representative data, when you're training. If the data reflects that real world diversity, then the AI, it's less likely to show that bias.
That makes sense. Garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah.
But even with good data, can't bias still, creep in?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where that second solution comes in, auditing for bias. The pattern's all about using statistical techniques to uncover those hidden biases, not just in the data itself, but in the algorithms too.
So it's like we're doing a deep dive into the AI, like a forensic analysis,
Yeah.
looking for any trace of that bias.
Exactly. You got it. It's about being proactive, not just assuming everything's going to be okay.
Right. And what's that third solution they're proposing?
Evaluating fairness, but with metrics. So the paper, it highlights these metrics like disparate impact, statistical parity, and equal opportunity. These, they let us actually quantify fairness and then measure, is the AI system making equitable decisions across all these different demographic groups?
Yeah, I'm familiar with those metrics from my work, so it's great to see them being applied here, specifically for responsible AI.
It's all about, moving beyond that gut feeling and using solid data to assess fairness. Now, the paper does say there can be this tension sometimes between accuracy and fairness.
Yeah, the classic trade-off.
Yeah.
How do we balance that?
Honestly, there's no easy answer, which is, refreshing. It really encourages us, us data scientists, to consider the context and make informed choices based on what the consequences might be if we prioritize one over the other.
Makes sense. It's a judgment call, but at least with these RAIDPs, we've got some guidance.
Exactly. It gives us this framework to make those decisions in a more systematic way, more transparent. Now, the authors, they didn't just, come up with these patterns. They actually did a survey of, AI ethics and data experts, wanted to see how these ideas are being used out in the real world.
Okay, what did they find? Are companies actually using these ideas?
Well, the results are promising, though there's, always room to grow. A lot of organizations now, they have those AI ethics policies in place, so they at least recognize it's important.
That's good. But policies are, just words. What about putting them into practice?
Well, it varies. Some organizations are really leading the charge. They've got dedicated teams, resources, all for AI ethics. Others, though, they're still figuring it out, how to actually make it happen.
So it's a mixed bag, but hey, at least things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. It's a journey, and not everyone's at the same spot on that journey. The survey also looked at the specific tools people are using. Some organizations are relying on those open libraries like AIF 360 and AIX 360 to help with that bias and make their AI systems more explainable.
I've used those. They're good tools.
Yeah.
Anything else interesting from that survey?
Yeah, they found a lot of different ways that organizations are controlling model performance once it's in production. It seems like, there's not one magic solution that works for everyone. Some, they've got really sophisticated monitoring and control systems. Others are still working on it.
So we need those best practices to, really emerge, especially as these AI systems get more complex and woven into our lives.
Absolutely. And lastly, they found that using specific tools for, privacy and security in that machine learning pipeline, it's still kind of developing. It's a big priority, but, there's more work to be done to come up with those effective solutions and use them.
So it sounds like responsible AI is still a work in progress, a lot of moving parts.
Definitely. But this paper gives us like a really good roadmap.
Yeah, so we've gone through a lot. Data collection, pre-processing, training, inference, deployment, and monitoring. It seems like these RDPs, they really cover the whole AI lifecycle.
Yeah, they do. It's this holistic framework. And to really show us how these patterns work, they dive into one specific example, the bias mitigation design pattern.
Let's hear more about that. How are they tackling this huge challenge in AI?
All right, so this bias mitigation design pattern, it's about, tackling that bias issue head on. And they've got three core solutions for this. First, using representative data when you're training. If that data reflects that real-world diversity, then the AI is, less likely to show bias.
Makes sense. Garbage in, garbage out, right? But even with good data, can't bias still kind of sneak in?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the second solution comes in. Auditing for bias. It's all about using those statistical techniques to try and uncover any hidden bias, not just in the data itself, but also in the algorithms.
So it's like we're doing a deep dive into the AI, kind of like a forensic analysis, right? Looking for any trace of that bias.
Exactly. You got it. It's about being proactive,
Yeah.
Not just assuming that everything's going to be fine.
Right. And what about that third solution? What
Yeah.
did they propose?
Evaluating fairness, but with metrics. So the paper, it highlights these metrics like disparate impact, statistical parity, and equal opportunity. And these metrics, they let us actually quantify fairness and measure, is the AI making equitable decisions across all these different demographic groups?
Yeah, I'm familiar with those metrics from my own work, so it's great to see them applied here, specifically for, responsible AI development.
It's about moving beyond, just that gut feeling and using those rigorous data-driven methods to assess fairness. Now, the paper acknowledges that sometimes there can be this tension, between accuracy and fairness.
The classic trade-off. So how do we balance that? How do we navigate that?
Honestly, there's no simple solution, which I think is actually refreshing. It encourages us, the data scientists, to really consider that specific context and make informed decisions,
Right.
thinking about the consequences of maybe prioritizing one over the other.
That makes sense. It's a judgment call. But at least with these REIDPs, we have, a little bit of guidance.
Exactly. It gives us this framework to make those tough decisions in a more systematic and transparent way. Now, the authors didn't just, come up with these patterns. They actually went out and did a survey of AI ethics and data experts, wanted to see how these ideas are actually being used in the real world.
Okay, so what did they find? Are companies actually putting these ideas into practice?
The results are promising. There's always room for improvement. But a lot of organizations now, they do have those AI ethics policies in place. They recognize that it's important.
That's good. But policies are, just words on paper. What about actual implementation? How are they doing there?
It varies. Some organizations are really leading the charge. They've got these dedicated teams, resources, all for AI ethics. But others, they're still figuring it out, how to actually operationalize these concepts.
So it's mixed bag. But hey, at least things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. It's a journey. And not everyone is at the same spot on that journey, right? The survey also looked at the specific tools that are being used, and some organizations are relying on those open libraries, like AIF 360 and AIX 360 to help with that bias issue and make their AI systems more explainable.
I've used those. They're great tools.
Hmm.
What else did the survey uncover? Anything else interesting?
One interesting finding was that there's a lot of different ways that companies are trying to control model performance once it's, out in production. And it seems like there's no one magic solution that's going to work for everyone. Some organizations, they've got these really sophisticated monitoring and control systems in place. Others are still working on those strategies.
So we need those best practices to emerge. Especially as AI systems get more and more complex and integrated into, everyday life.
Absolutely. And lastly, they found that using those specific tools for, privacy and security in that machine learning pipeline, it's still kind of a work in progress. It's definitely a priority, but, we still need more work to develop and implement those effective solutions.
So it sounds like the field of responsible AI is, still rapidly evolving.
It is. But this research paper, it gives us like a really valuable roadmap.
Yeah, for sure. So to wrap up our discussion of this paper, let's distill those key takeaways. What are those core insights for someone, like me working in AI development?
The core takeaway here is that responsible AI, it's not just some abstract ideal, it's a set of practical design patterns that can and should be integrated into every single stage of that machine learning pipeline. These RAIDPs, they offer this systematic approach to building AI systems that are not just, powerful and effective, but also align with, our ethical values.
It's like we're being given this toolkit for, responsible AI development.
Exactly. And it's a toolkit we all need to be familiar with, as AI becomes more and more embedded in our world. So as AI gets, more sophisticated, how do we make sure that our ethical frameworks keep up? Do those current metrics for fairness, do they really capture all those forms of potential bias? It's something to, really think about.
It's definitely a lot to consider. And thanks for breaking down those RAIDPs. I think this framework will be really helpful for anyone working in AI development, to make sure we're building systems that are not just, effective, but also ethical.
Absolutely.
And to our listeners, if you're interested in diving deeper into this topic, we'll be sure to link the research paper in our show notes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into responsible AI development.